All right, I'm going to tweet out the link here. And that's about it. All right, so the impetus for this discussion happening now is that there is another round of hysteria and mania over the supposed hacking, quote unquote, of the election, quote unquote, by Russia. Now, this stuff has been germinating for a long time now, something like 6 months. I think probably around July of this year is when Democrats in particular started to seriously harp on this notion that Donald Trump is an agent of the Kremlin in some way, and he was seeking to subvert the U.S. government to assist somehow his Kremlin benefactors, and his association with Putin was supposed to be exceptionally close, and everyone was supposed to be really worried about this. But now it's gotten to the point where you see it asserted as definitive fact in the New York Times, in NPR, other reputable outfits that Russia hacked the election. So I was listening to NPR yesterday, and the presenter said something along the lines of, the presenter was characterizing the CIA's quote unquote findings, and the way she put it was that Russia messed with our election. So what's going on is they're conflating a multitude of disparate events and putting it under the banner of Russia hacked the election, even though what they're referring to is John Podesta, Hillary's former campaign chairman, clicking on a suspicious link in his Gmail, and then the Democratic National Committee hacks. But these are being conflated, so the casual news consumer is getting the impression, I think, that Russia's state actors actively manipulated the actual vote tabulation, so that they're sort of getting a faulty takeaway about what's going on here. Anyway, it's a whole mess. I'm wondering if that seems like a reasonable. First of all, does that seem like a reasonable summary to you?
I think so. I mean, I think you have to look at, again, if our goal here is to find out, cut through the static and find out why it is that this commentary is percolating now. What are they trying to do? So you have a number of different players involved. So I mean, you have the former members of the Clinton campaign, you have members of the major media, you have institutional actors within the CIA and the State Department, engaging in a turf war potentially with the FBI, staking out claims and positions for the incoming administration. So you have, in fact, in the Russian media, there was generally speaking, it's been pretty quiet. Like there hasn't been, I was checking the last 4 days to try to see, this must be a hot subject of discussion, even in the more independent Russian media. I mean, the very independent media, so the TV Rain, which is really the last major independent news channel in Russia, it's all internet streaming because none of these people are allowed on broadcast television anymore. Or the blog sites, Echo of Moscow, which is really the last kind of independent radio station. All the people who are not sort of either working for media companies or newspapers that are partly state-owned or are censored in some way by the Kremlin or one way or the other, the people who can actually give some kind of independent, genuine analysis that you can find quasi-credible. And mostly it's been pretty quiet. The reaction since November 8th has been running the spectrum of Trump is a completely unknown quantity. I'm just saying, like, before we get to the issues of the hacking and how some commentary on what they view would be happening with the CIA and where this might be coming from. But basically the reaction among Russian kind of independent analysts is Trump ranges from the spectrum of businessman with whom the Kremlin might be able to narrowly agree in a few specific areas, might be some shifting of some sanctions, there might be some give and take in the Middle East, obviously on Syria, now that the Aleppo front has been basically closed out. Now we have this Palmyra second front opening and all sorts of potential there. But really there isn't much at all general impression that Trump is some kind of a Kremlin puppet at all. At best, like I said, some narrow agreement or an unknown quantity. They don't know who this guy is in the Kremlin, as far as these analysts are concerned. At best, maybe he might be a second coming of Berlusconi, maybe, who was, of course, the Italian prime minister and reputably, next to Gerhard Schroeder, probably Putin's favorite, closest political leader with whom he had the best relationship in Western Europe. But that's pretty much it. There's nowhere near the kind of temperature of the sort of stuff that we're hearing in the Washington Post, NPR, the major networks. Now,
and that's worth lingering on for a moment, because if you, like you said, take the temperature of U.S. domestic media outfits, it's universally it has been portrayed that Putin overwhelmingly favors Trump, the Kremlin overwhelmingly favors Trump, Russia as a whole is somehow united in their love for Trump. But you're saying that's not a full picture of what the actual attitude is.
No, not at all. That doesn't mean that these people are favorable to Trump, that they're fans of Trump, closet, Trump train members at all. Many of these people, they run the gamut from sort of more traditional Orthodox nationalists to people who are, veterans of the liberal politics of the 90s to, the new activists like Navalny and people who are in those circles, the sort of the new age, new media people. They don't really know what to make of him. I think they're, again, because they're looking at this through how would this impact us directly? How would this impact the actions of Putin, or will it impact his actions? So they're looking at it strictly from a Russia kind of centric prism. They're not engaging in the kind of politics and discussion we're engaging in here, on how did immigration factor into this? How did, the white working class grievances factor into, they're not really considering that as much. So they're, acknowledging that's what the Western media is saying as reasons for Trump winning Rust Belt states or things like that. But again, their level of granular analysis of the US election is really not anywhere near what we would be talking about. So from their perspective is when they view Trump as what realistically do they expect to happen practically? Putting aside, they don't deal in hysteria. They deal in what would impact on my life and policy options from the US. Will there be some major fundamental shift in the status quo, and how will this impact what the Kremlin does? That's what they're focused on. Because domestic politics in Russia is basically over. it has been over since at least 2012. We could get into that later. Things have basically entered into a kind of political stagnation in one form or another. So as far as they look at Trump, they're not fans of him. They don't necessarily have a high opinion of him, but they certainly don't see him as a fool. They also didn't actually see Obama as an idiot. How the Western, a lot of people on the right, especially, were like, oh my God, Obama's just giving away the store to Putin. That's not the way that these people regarded Obama. Even. Right. I think it might be some kind of respect for the US presidency, I don't really know, but really the view of Obama among these Russian analysts was, well, he basically has been sort of more or less doing what we would have expected an American president to do. We didn't expect massive intervention in Syria. We didn't expect anything beyond the sanctions levy on Ukraine and Crimea realistically. So he's not doing anything that's completely out of the ordinary. There's no grand commentary or consensus of Obama was weak and caving, and Trump is now going to cave even more. Or alternatively, Trump is a new era of standing up to Putin in confrontation. It's a much more cynical, pragmatic view. So I guess then to sum that up, they don't really know what to make of him. They think that he basically is a pragmatist. They don't really think there would be profound changes, certainly domestically in Russia, in reaction to Trump's winning, or really in US foreign policy in the grand scheme of things. Vis-a-vis Russia, although they think at best there might be some movement. But certainly, they, and I actually commented on this a couple of days ago, the view of Clinton in particular was diametrically opposed to the image that was painted by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the rest. The image that was painted and what she tried to put out in the last months of the campaign, I'm the hawk. I'm going to stand up to Putin, forget the reset that failed. This is a new era. We're going to stand up to him in Ukraine, Syria. We're going to push back. We're not going to allow any threats to Eastern Europe were going to continue. That's not the way that these analysts, and these are people who were former politicians, people who have some links to Russian intelligence agencies or who were veterans of some of these government agencies. That's not the way that they viewed Clinton at all. But they viewed Clinton as, this is someone who the Kremlin knows about, 30 years in politics, they've worked with her, they know her weaknesses and strengths. This is a known quantity. There won't be many surprises here. Just put the rhetoric aside. This is somebody that we at least know what the red lines really are. Trump, no idea. He could be anything. So that actually, of course, is a huge plus for Trump, which we can talk about with this Tillerson pick and how that factors into the picture, but confirming exactly what you're saying. I was really just stunned by A, how little hysteria there was, and B, how, this is just not really changing the temperature of any perception of Trump one way or the other.
And that would be a serious irony if the prevailing view of Hillary was that she's a known quantity, we can deal with her, no surprises. That would actually probably lend itself to stability, I would think, in the eyes of the Russian analysts that you cite. Whereas with regard to Trump, if he's a total unknown quantity, that could end up backfiring on them and actually potentially be an even greater danger. So the popular media consensus in the United States that Russia was universally in favor of Trump, or the Russian state apparatus, had taken upon itself to interfere on Trump's behalf, doesn't really seem to align with the sketch you just laid out there.
Yeah, not really. I think that even a lot of the media coverage in Russia, I'm in D.C., so to the extent that I, pay attention to what the official media put out for interest. A lot of the media coverage was really more oriented to not necessarily how wonderful Trump is, how chaotic the American election process is. So in that context, obviously a lot of focus on racial tensions, a lot of focus on, the rise of Sanders and all of this, chaos at the DNC, focus on just painting a sort of cynical image of, look, they keep criticizing our demonstrably problematic excuse for a democratic, what they call sovereign democratic process, which of course we could get into, but obviously that's, littered with manipulation, fraud, and all sorts of rigging that's actually the case. But, and to the extent that we had issues, they sort of focus, and this was also done, there was some embarrassing news coverage of some, alleged riots in, parts of Paris and some European states, which Channel 1, Dmitry Kiselyov, who's sort of main anchor, sort of the Bill O'Reilly of Channel 1 in Russia, which is the main state-owned network there, basically made it out to be like Paris was on fire, like people were running for their lives. They actually sent reporters in to pretend that they were, bystanders in Paris fleeing as rocks were flying, and then a French comedy show just like ripped him to pieces, just like saying, this is just ridiculous from day one. These were all plants. Like none of these people who were interviewed consented to have all of, what they said included. So the whole thing was just a hit job. So this is sort of the kind of stuff that they were painting, that America is in chaos, Trump and Sanders, and, who are they to talk when they're criticizing, our democratic problems and trying to stick their noses in our affairs. So that was really
and there's a kernel of truth to that, right? Maybe it's marshaled for cynical reasons because Russia wants to burnish its image, or it wants to paint itself as superior in some way in terms of its democratic institutions. But nevertheless, whatever their motive might have been in emphasizing that portrayal, it is sort of correct. I would advise taking a cynical view of the way that U.S. democracy is functioning at present. That's why it's always so frustrating to have people with sinecures at think tanks and who are basically living comfortable lives take great offense when they see American democracy portrayed as a little more unstable or a little more chaotic or fragile than they would like. Because that's just sort of reality. So to frame that depiction as somehow advantageous to Russia, it may well be, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not true or accurate.
Well, I mean, I guess the way that I would frame it is, look, I mean, in Russia, you have a fundamental absence of independent institutions. You don't have an independent judiciary, for all intents and purposes. I mean, I don't need to get into, even the issues surrounding, the Khodorkovsky case one way or the other. And, there was sort of a running joke, at the beginning of the 2000s, which is, despite the fact that the end result, that a lot of what the Putin government began to do, targeting rivals in the media, political rivals, were politically motivated, it was really sometimes hard to gain the public sympathy because there was more than a kernel of truth to some of the allegations of the charges. So, in other words, like you had a TV magnate Kuczynski who was forced into exile in the early 2000s on tax evasion and fraud charges that were hanging over him in absentia, and then the problem was that some of that was in fact accurate. I mean, in the 90s there was a lot of dirty dealing going on, but the motivation behind that was because he was a chief, his television network NTV was a major opponent of Putin and was criticizing him fiercely, and we can get into that if you want. But basically, it is complicated, but what I'm saying is that when you have a fundamental absence of democratic institutions and processes that work and that are credible in Russia, which you do, their portrayal of American democracy as dysfunctional is cynical. I mean, this is basically I wouldn't say gaslighting, but I mean it's an attempt at deflection. It's not genuine criticism that you would be hearing from Le Monde or that you would be hearing from the Telegraph. I mean, to the extent that I'm just saying, like, we're operating in two different universes here. That's
right. So it could be
more cynical. But to your point, just to close that point off, to not kind of deviate too much from the original kind of question. Again, getting back to Trump, that really doesn't, that's not a fundamentally, cheerleading coverage of Trump, and not a cheerleading coverage of Trump. It basically is just a coverage of dysfunction. But you can't from this infer that the entire time this was being sort of portrayed as Trump as our guy, and he's, as you said, like he's set up to be a puppet and whatever. And even beyond that media image, to the extent the kind of official state media image, whose credibility you can sort of take with several bags of salt, the bottom line is, what are those who are pulling the levers of power in the Kremlin really thinking? That's what we care about. We don't really care about some of what the state media says. We care about what they really think. And from what I have been gathering, their thought process is, like I said, quite unpredictable, wait and see, maybe some gains, but not a complete fundamental. So officially, and you're hearing this from NPR, Washington Post, they keep retweeting these, officials in Putin's party, the press secretary or something, all this, how happy we are that Tillerson has been picked, how thrilled we are that Trump is, moving ahead. And I mean, take that and then have a more sober, nuanced analysis of what they're really thinking behind closed doors. And unfortunately, that sober analysis is totally lacking in the Western coverage for reasons having more to do with hatred of Trump and all the baggage left over from the election. I think less to do with actually getting to the truth of this Russia issue.
Yeah. I just think there's a tendency on the part of American analysts and people in the commentariat who are adversarial toward Russia to look at the way that Russia tends to emphasize the more chaotic elements of American democratic society and say that, if we allow that narrative to prevail, if we give in to this impulse to overemphasize certain discord or certain unrest, that means we're somehow bolstering the Russian narrative, when it might well be the case that Russian state media is correct to deduce that certain dynamics in American society are underemphasized. Now and they want to play that up. Now that might be born of cynical motivations, and it probably is, because there's certainly a democratic deficit in Russia itself. But that alone doesn't discredit, or that wouldn't alone undermine the validity of inferring that, yes, maybe some of these more chaotic features of American society do need to be amplified I remember back during the Occupy Wall Street movement, there was a big play on the part of RT to cover it pretty intensively, and this is that. So intensively covering Occupy Wall Street might have served the purposes of the Russian state media in that it gave a platform to American dissenters and to police violence and all these other kind of things that gave an impression of chaos reigning in the United States. But at the same time, they did some decent coverage, and they really did fill certain voids that had been left by the American.
Right. I mean, that's that's sort of going back to what I said. Like, it's hard to tell the public all these people are full of it and liars when there's more than a kernel of truth to some of what they're saying. Like that's the problem. In other words, you need to help us now, said the people who the public no longer trusted, in the 1990s. Like, now is who you have to look out for when he in fact stole more than we did. Then the question was, yeah, but you guys still stole stuff yourselves. So why are you credible now? Why should you be, the new heroes coming in to save the day? So that's really what I was sort of getting at. But in that case, you're right. I mean, it goes sort of to the Trump adage, there's no such thing as bad press. All press is good press, right? So, to the extent that some contrarian economic ideas, I mean, from, I don't want to become, a spokesperson at all for, cheerleader of RT, but getting back to your kind of point, the fact that you had Nigel Farage appear there before he really got anywhere. And I mean, a lot of the major media in the UK wouldn't even cover him. He was on RT. Jim Rogers, great investor, was there. Peter Schiff was there. I mean, people on the left, I don't know, Chomsky, I guess, was there. But people who had even
Ron Paul was featured a lot.
Ron Paul, all the time, still there. Even people who I, disagree with, whatever your political views, left or right. Now, the motive, which is what I would emphasize.
Chris Hedges, I remember, appeared a lot.
Right. So the motivation, as you said correctly, is largely cynical, almost entirely cynical. This isn't an attempt to, let's have a sober, intellectual, enlightening conversation for Russian viewers who more or less don't watch RT, don't see it, and don't know who's appearing there. They're not listening to Ron Paul in Moscow and St. Petersburg. That I can tell you on RT for the most part. That's not what your average Russian is looking at. But to the extent that we looked at it and these people were appearing, they were essentially following that adage. Like, I don't care if it's RT. I have a message. They're giving me a platform. I'm going to use the platform to get the message out. Of course, great.
And I'll be honest, RT asked me to appear a couple times several years ago, and they didn't dictate what I said. I stated my honest views, and if those happen to, in some very broad or abstract sense, further the Russian state media goal, I mean, that doesn't detract from the rightness or wrongness of what I was communicating.
No, that's what I'm saying. I agree with you completely, and that gets back to what you said about Occupy or Tea Party or whatever, whatever they chose to emphasize for what their motives were. The fact that this was actually showing up, because we weren't seeing this on CNN and we weren't seeing this on Fox, sadly, which then gets back to kind of a broader commentary, and that's the problem. I like the fact that Ron Paul was there. I like the fact that Nigel Farage was there and these other people, because before they became enough and there was enough, they were blocking these people. So it was good that they were on. So, then I think I agree with you, fundamentally. I'm just sort of trying to separate motive and, why certain coverages, why a certain image is being painted, and to detach that, disassociate that with the rightness or wrongness of the underlying concerns, which I agree with you. Those really should be sort of two separate things. And that gets to Trump. In other words, I think this is much more not a Russia media image issue, not a Russia government perception issue. This is a U.S. media and Clinton campaign post-election grudge issue. I mean, it really is just, and people, I think, it's kind of incredible to me. I mean, you have a secret assessment in the CIA that ends up being leaked to the Washington Post. Was there a Daniel Ellsberg there? So this is going to be like a Pentagon Papers Part 2 or something? Like, it's just so incredibly a heavily politicized CIA led by John Brennan in the last months of Obama's administration have an assessment fully summarized by the Daily Beast and the Washington Post which in fact includes in the summary, we don't have direct evidence of the Kremlin directing the hacking in an attempt to assist Trump. Putting aside whether this actually swayed anybody, which I think we could credibly say it didn't. There was a great article by a Telegraph columnist at CNN today, and actually Piers Morgan had a phenomenal article in Daily Mail. I don't know if you saw it. I mean, he's been one of the more sympathetic.
Yeah, I mean, talk about cynical motivations underlying why certain narratives are crafted. I mean, that would be this current phase of Russia hacking mania. It seems utterly cynical. I mean, because every report that's come out, starting with the Washington Post on Friday, which rejiggered this hysteria, very little of it has any new information. I mean, what the narrow claim that appears to be new in the Washington Post report that sort of spurred everything was that now there's the CIA apparently conveyed to congressional sources that they now supposedly have evidence that Russian state actors gave hacked information to WikiLeaks. Now, of course, they never produced any evidence for this, but that would be the one nugget of new information that seems to have been produced. But otherwise, it seems it's just rehashed stuff that's been around for months, and yet it's completely dominated the American media discussion to the degree that now you have congressmen calling for the Electoral College to thwart Trump, which would be unprecedented in the entire history of the United States, literally going back to 1788. I mean, that's how extreme that's the extremism of the lengths to which some of these people want to go in reaction to this latest round of Russian nonsense. But you mentioned a little while ago that there doesn't seem to be much coverage of this in the independent Russian media. So that to me indicates that there's some disconnect here. I mean, because if there was some legitimacy to this craze, presumably it would get some coverage in the Russian independent media, because it would be a huge story. I mean, if Russian state actors successfully manipulated the electoral process of the world's lone superpower, then you think that would probably result in some coverage.
Right. I mean, I think I'm not saying they're not mentioning it. Obviously, there are kind of lead stories like, allegations of this, and looking at some potential, why would the CIA report come out and whatever. But there certainly isn't. I haven't seen hysteria, and there certainly isn't that kind of level of, and this, I've been looking back, for the past, week. Obviously, it's hard to get some of this analysis there in real time, just when, people get together and when these interviews are taped and everything else. But there, this is just not the fundamental subject of discussion. I mean, there are so many other problems in Russia that they're not, obsessing over this, and forget about foreign policy. I mean, just domestic issues that people are worried about, because we kind of forget. We like to view, and this is, the U.S. loves to believe that we're the only ones with domestic problems. Every other country is just, all they're thinking about every waking moment is the U.S. It's just this sort of amorphous kind of block, territorial landmass, and we sort of have to be reactive to it. They sort of forget, well, there are 140 million people in Russia. They have, day-to-day problems, and a lot of what they're focused on is, inflation and bad roads, infrastructure falling apart, and other more mundane concerns, and that's a lot of what they're focused on. So that kind of drowns out some of the hysteria. So, but this goes back to what I'm saying, which is, if your frame of reference is Trump is an unknown quantity, he's not. There's no reason to suggest that he's a puppet, and certainly not a Kremlin agent. I mean, they're probably laughing at that. They have a much more pragmatic view. Then why would you have so much hysteria? The hysteria is if you genuinely believe that he is a Kremlin puppet. Yay! Look at how everybody's in a frenzy. He's putting all of his people up. I mean, it's just if you don't have that frame of reference, you say, well, there are some issues. I mean, actually, there was one great article in Kommersant, which is sort of the Russian equivalent of the Wall Street Journal, looking at this issue through the frame of reference of what will Mike Pompeo do when he becomes new CIA director. In other words, how will he manage the agency? It was a great, very well reasoned kind of piece about anti-Trump forces, or as the article described, or forces that are skeptical of Trump or hostile to Trump in the CIA right now, institutional forces, either people from the John Brennan's era, or maybe even from the Tenet era, or even earlier than that. I mean, whoever might not be the source of the leak to the Washington Post, might be. Whoever there is quite discomforted with Trump. How will he handle them versus the priorities that Trump and his team will have coming in? So he's going to be kind of potentially pushed between these two forces. How will he be able to balance this? So that was a very well-reasoned piece of, looking at it. So will he be able to tame this, and how will this impact CIA policy going forward and U.S. policy largely vis-a-vis Russia, Middle East, and Eastern Europe? So there was some of that, but
so I mean, strictly
nowhere near the necessary.
Yeah, strictly on the issue of the CIA leak, right? If you read the Washington Post story, the source for that story is the entire basis for the story is somebody in Congress or a congressional source characterizing what the CIA told them in a private briefing. So the story wasn't based on any firsthand evidence that had been provided to them by a CIA source. It was a secondhand portrayal of what the CIA had presented in a private meeting by a congressional source. So a congressional source is going to be a partisan in all likelihood. They're going to have partisan motives at play. And Marcy Wheeler, who is goes by Empty Wheel online, she is a very astute observer of these kinds of things, and she speculated that the most likely source, who wasn't named in the Washington Post article, is probably Harry Reid himself or Dianne Feinstein. So if it was one of those two, I mean, that would be crucial context to be aware of, because obviously they're going to have certain incentives to play up elements of the CIA briefing that might be disputed by others. So, Mitch McConnell apparently didn't.
Disputed, not just by the FBI, by Clapper, by DNI, and et cetera, and by others. I mean, you're right.
People are so primed to believe that this Trump is a Kremlin agent theory that they just automatically ran with that Washington Post report as definitive proof that their concerns have been finally validated.
I mean, and while there are two aspects of this, it does have kind of, I mean, what the article was more that I was focusing on was, where did the secret assessment come from? The Washington Post, we have a secret assessment inside the CIA. It does have a bit of, I have 250 names of communist sympathizers. Where are they? I mean, I have them on my plane. They're in the briefcase. I'll get them to you later, but without getting them. I mean, and on the other hand, and I kind of agree with this. Look, okay, in terms of having an investigation, fine. I think we should be investigating threats to our secure networks, our classified networks, cybersecurity threats and problems or whatever. But isn't that kind of the job of the sitting administration and these same intelligence agencies to protect these networks? So why isn't the focus of the media on linking, again, without any evidence, certainly, either linking Trump directly, then, in other words, the source of the evidence of intent that the Kremlin directed a hacking operation to assist Trump to win, and even the more relevant factor, which is that this had any impact on the election at all. So neither of those things have been really proven. But the more important point is, why is Trump focus of this firestorm, when shouldn't it be, why are our cyber networks, why is our cybersecurity in such a horrible state? How is this allowed to happen in the first place? Shouldn't that be the more sober, sensible analysis? And that's just, I think it was like some kind of Katie Tour. God, she's horrible. To a tweet or something, I think today says like, why is Trump not, it's something about like intelligence briefings. So why is he meeting with Kanye when he should be figuring out, you have to tell the Trump supporter that this Russian hacking story is really important. Like, I mean, it's just like, you don't even know how to approach this anymore. So, so I agree with that completely. So on several levels,
I think that
this thing is becoming crazy. And before kind of shifting to kind of another point, the worst part about it is focusing on what we care about, which is how will U.S. policy toward Russia change, and what Russian policy actually driven by? Isn't that what we should be focusing on? Like, why is Russia doing what it's doing? What will it be doing going forward? And what should we be doing or not be doing about it, rather than this? Like, what's the focus of this, aside from a purely cynical political play? How is this advancing our interests, and how is this helping us one way or another? I'm just saying, like, in the national interest as a country. I'm not talking about, the cynical motivations of the various players and why they're all like, moths to a flame pushing this and continuing to go into, kind of, Jeb, you're going to be so far off the stage on that side of the stage, you're going to fall off. So kind of, that's like where things are, where things are going now. I like to always.
Let me just interject there. I mean, I think the fundamental reason why they've placed Trump at the center of this, rather than focusing on, prudent cybersecurity measures that could be taken to strengthen, defenses against, intrusions. I think, the central core fundamental reason why they've all kind of glommed onto this Trump notion is because they want to delegitimize Trump. I mean, they're still roiled by the election result. They are still traumatized, a lot of them, by it. So they're going to latch on to whatever is available to make the election look illegitimate, and therefore make Trump's presidency look illegitimate. So I think that's what's driving this. It's as simple as that. I mean, that sounds sort of like a cheap partisan motivation, but I think that's the reason.
No, right, and that's what I'm saying. I'm saying, like, and I agree with that completely. But when the dust settles, what this is doing is, again, throwing static up to prevent us from discussing what we really should be discussing, is where to, with regard to U.S.-Russia relations and policies, our foreign policy toward Russia, and can we take a more sober, correct assessment of what Russian foreign policy has been doing and what has been motivating it for the past couple of years, instead of the kind of nonsense, I think really superficial, level one analysis that we've been receiving, or excuses for analysis, because this kind of stuff distracts us from what people really care about. That's what I'm.
And here's what's pernicious: if the Democrats and some of their newfound neoconservative allies have these overheated investigations going on in perpetuity that are continually resulting in accusations that Russia directly meddled in the American election on behalf of Trump, that could very feasibly harm the potential to forge a new policy vis-a-vis Russia. So this could really have a practical detrimental impact on that score, don't you think?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I think that it would definitely lead to people making mistakes. I mean, I think that if and this gets, I think, to the most important point, is what has been actually going on in reality. What is motivating Vladimir Putin? Circle. What is is Russia the greatest geostrategic threat that the United States faces at the moment? I mean, these are the questions that we should be asking. My answer to that is no, not really. I mean, I think that when you have, what's fascinating was, when Boris Nemtsov was still alive, he advocated targeted sanctions against members of the Kremlin inner circle, a number of names, Sechin, who's the head of Rosneft, Timchenko, Rothenberg brothers. I mean, these are people tied to Gazprom, people who are massive infrastructure interests, investment bankers. I mean, people who are the financial muscle power in the Kremlin behind Vladimir Putin, who were, of course, put there based on their relationships with him over the years. And these people are really concerned. I mean, it actually has taken a serious toll on their lives, on their investments, on their assets, because these people spend very little of their time in Russia. They're not investing in Russia all that much. They're not sending their kids to Russian schools. They're not driving Russian cars. They're not living in estates in the middle of nowhere in, Pskov or Irkutsk or whatever. I mean, they're all, with apartments in London, and they're in Switzerland, and that's where their kids go to boarding school, with Oxford and Harvard ambitions. So they don't want to be cut off from that, and their businesses can't afford to be cut off from Western financing. So, do these people really have a vested interest in rolling the tanks through Eastern Europe? No. I mean, at the end of the day, and on top of that, and again, this is like mistake after mistake. Another article, I forgot where I read, which is again going into after the Ukraine intervention and the support for the separatists and the sending in of Russian troops and the Crimean annexation, all the rest of it, there was new hysteria that was in Eastern Europe because, you know, the Russians are about to send the tanks over the border into Tallinn. I mean, they have the ready-made ethnic Russian population of, you know, a fifth of the population of Estonia or so. I mean, they're a ready-made column of support, base of support for imminent Russian invasion. The only problem is, again, the Russian Estonians who live there, you know, there are cities there in Estonia, Narva, for example, really majority Russian, de facto already Russian cities, only Russians pretty much live there. You know, they could go to Russia at any time. A lot of these people can basically travel visa-free to Russia. They could travel visa-free across the EU. They've made a conscious choice to remain in Estonia. I mean, they like the benefits of Estonia, the economic benefits. They've lived there for a long time. There's no evidence to suggest whatsoever that what happened there, what happened in Eastern Ukraine, what happened in Estonia, if there was, for some reason, which I don't see any basis whatever, because Russia would be a complete pariah state, I think, really, if that would actually happen, of any kind of intervention. But this is what I'm talking about. Like, we just don't, this isn't even discussed. There's no pause button. It's just an automatic assumption of, okay, you know, Trump better not talk about any concessions from some of these NATO countries, even though Estonia, you know, pays its 2%. But I mean, just because, you know, what would happen if that were to happen? They're putting missiles in Kaliningrad. You know what that would mean? That doesn't mean anything. What else do they have? What card do they have to play except really putting that out to send a rather hollow message? And I'd love to, you know, depending on how much time we have to get into some of this, and I wrote about this in October of last year in an article that was put up by the Business Insider about the Syria conflict, why Putin decided then to get involved in Syria, which, again, at the time, the level of hysteria from both sides, from Clinton, Rubio was calling for a no-fly zone, Clinton was calling for a no-fly zone, that was, of course, being, you know, the question that was asked, how are we going to resist this new interjection? And there was just no analysis as to why did the Putin and the military establishment in Russia decide on moving into Syria at that particular time.
And you know what, that dearth of analysis is only going to get worse, and that's why I think the Trump hysteria is so pernicious, because now U.S.-Russia relations is being viewed primarily through the lens of Trump's supposedly nefarious association with Putin. Therefore, there's not going to be any room to offer a sober-minded analysis, because the Trump element is going to be so dominant.
No, and more importantly, that's what will be the final outcome of that, I fear, is another set of really foolish policy decisions that are completely unrelated, bad for U.S. interests, don't really in one form or another change what Russia does, and involve us in something that we can't extract ourselves from. I mean, I'm not just talking about another Libya. I'm not just talking about, you know, what's happening in Syria and what we should or shouldn't be doing there. But I'm just saying, like, this sort of automatic knee-jerk response that we keep hearing, and we're still hearing it, and I agree with the main point that the focus on Trump will only make the knee-jerk response worse, because if you start saying anything else, as I've done and others have done, you're labeled, well, you're a Putin apologist.
And it probably, disturbingly, portends a long-term reorientation of the Democratic Party's posture toward Russia, because, you know, for this foreseeable future now, they're going to see Russia as a right-wing enabler of Trump, and therefore their disposition is going to be more antagonistic toward Russia and for going forward. And who knows how that'll manifest policy-wise.
And what's really funny is, I mean, I hate to say it, but who was one of the chief enablers, I wouldn't say a chief enabler, but I wouldn't go that far, but certainly a contributor, whose policies were a contributor to creating the conditions for Putin's elevation to the prime ministership and then the presidency? Bill Clinton. He presided during his 2 terms over that decade where Russia could have taken any number of roads. He made, in my view, a series of major mistakes and the Bush 41 administration did as well. Beginning just how they totally mishandled. I mean, George H.W. Bush actually sent a letter to the then Ukrainian SSR, basically the government of then the Soviet Republic of Ukraine before it became independent, basically saying, hold off on independence. Essentially, he was urging them not to secede peacefully from the Soviet Union. You know, we're going to try to resuscitate this thing. So George H.W. Bush literally and his foreign policy advisors were very skeptical of Boris Yeltsin, were very skeptical of the liberal reformers or those sort of anti-Soviet forces that were coming to the fore to create an independent Russia. He had put his eggs in the Gorbachev basket. So he was actually, believe it or not, trying to hold off the breakup of the Soviet Union for a few years. And this sort of continued with Bill Clinton, who I think missed a major opportunity. He was very reactive. And, you know, we could talk about the bombing of, you know, the campaign, you know, the NATO campaign regarding, you know, Kosovo in 1999, which I think was, from a Russian perspective. I'm not saying, you know, I'm not to get into the granular of, from a U.S. policy standpoint, or whether or not from a moral standpoint that was the right or the wrong thing to do. How was this perceived within the Kremlin? How did this impact the Yeltsin government then? And what happened to the forces that could have thwarted some of what was happening that resulted in Putin coming to power? It really weakened them. They became discredited. At the same time, you had a huge financial crisis in Russia, the default of August 98, the year prior. So Russia was in a state of economic weakness, chaos. And then you had the expansion of NATO, which Bill Clinton agreed to, I think, because of pressure from some more kind of hawkish forces in Congress. So he was, you know, election year, the election just ended. He wanted to, you know, be tougher. And at the same time, doing this, completely disregarding that maybe it was important that Russia, at this point in time, not be given yet more reason to be resentful. Maybe that should have been a factor in the decision making. I think it really wasn't. And Yeltsin, who at that time was becoming weaker and weaker, the liberal forces were becoming, or at least the more centrist, more Western-oriented, or people who may have disagreed with Yeltsin, but at least would have continued something along the lines of a foreign policy where we wouldn't be in the place that we are right now vis-a-vis the, you know, Russia-U.S. relations. They were weakened, and you had the strengthening of those organs, those bases of within power centers within the Russian government that cultivated Vladimir Putin, and that greatly helped him and backed him when he became the prime minister and then the president. And then Putin arrives, and now all of a sudden, all of this is forgotten. That's what's stunning to me. It's like as if the 1990s never happened. It's like this, there was this vacuum, then Putin emerged, and now it's like, okay, we're back to 1960. It's 1960, 1980 all over again. You know, we're back to those same black and white sort of, without any context, set of policy options vis-a-vis Russia, back to business as usual. That, to me, is just incredible, you know, how much amnesia exists among some of these policymakers and analysts. And that drives a lot of these really weak, kind of hollow discussions on this whole stuff. And that brings us to what we're talking about now. You know, sort of sorry for the, you know, the quick trip down memory lane, but I think
no,
like, you know,
it's worth it because they're, yeah, like these discussions are so devoid of context for the most part. And there are people who parade around as amateur experts on Russia who truly have no idea what they're talking about. And I don't purport myself to be an expert on Russia. You know, I guess I'm sort of, you know, reasonably, you know, self-educated on the subject, but nothing close to expertise. But even I don't feel equipped necessarily to opine on many of these sort of more long-standing issues. But it's so short-term, and especially the depictions of Putin as some kind of, I don't know, radical strongman type figure. It doesn't. It's just intellectually lazy, and I always want to ask Democrats. So back when Obama was negotiating with Putin, and when he made the START treaty a central facet of his first term, for a policy agenda. Did that make Obama an enabler of Russian aggression? I mean, what happened over the course of just 4 years, such that your entire posture toward Russia has completely flipped? And the obvious answer to that question is the Trump variable. Now they see this as just a convenient way to bludgeon Trump, and they're just going to throw away all the gains that have been made under Obama, flawed as they might have been, just for short-term political expediency. And I think that impulse is disruptive.
Right. I mean, I think, you can't put aside, if you have a largely PR, which I think is accurate, not ideologically driven Putin government, but a PR driven government with a policy that's aimed toward, basically on the one hand, internally maintaining a kind of state of siege, internally maintaining a state of, deflection and confrontation with the West, while outwardly seeking accommodation with the West, a kind of 1945 grand bargain, which I think is sort of what is being sought. And it's a reactive government. There's, again, back to what you were saying, like, Putin as evil mastermind, or Putin as, reactionary, savior of the Christian West, Putin as, this is exactly the kind of thing, like they're happy that this is what we're, focusing on. In reality, I think, again, this is a tremendous overestimation. And I think Trump and I think Tillerson, who, now that he's nominated, I think they certainly won't be making that mistake, because they're pragmatists, they're sober people, they work in, their world is one of business, they're not ideologues. So I think when you're dealing, when ideologues comment on non-ideologues, they tend to assume everyone is an ideologue, oftentimes, I think. Like, people just project not only their prejudices, but they also just assume people think the way they do. So if you cut your teeth in the 1980s or earlier, if you cut your teeth in, the Great Cold War struggle, or thereafter, that you've been, pushing these values and these talking points and these assessments for decades, it's hard to now deal with someone who is just utterly cynical, utterly pragmatic, and driven by a whole host of personal domestic considerations that have nothing to do with your ideology. That's just really difficult for you to deal with. And that's what I think you're seeing, this really coming, I think, more from conservative resistance, traditional conservative resistance to Trump, is any inch supposed, what they would even frame as compromise, or anything other than the rhetoric of the 1980s on Russia is, well, complete sea change, because we know who Putin is. Well, we do know who Putin is, but that doesn't tell us anything about why he's doing what he does. Yes, we do know who Putin is. We hear this from Rubio and McCain all the time. We got it. But that doesn't mean that the reason that Putin the reason that he entered into Syria and what he's doing in Ukraine is driven by what Rubio and McCain believe it's driven by, largely. Or people who have come from that camp. It's, in my view, and I think the view of a lot of the analysts that I've cited at the beginning of our chat, it's driven by something far more straightforward. It's just basically a PR gambit, especially Ukraine, Crimea. After 2012, there was a huge boost of domestic support for the regime, and Putin is a very public support, believe it or not, PR conscious individual. And Crimea gave him about a year of amazingly good PR. Those sectors of society, I wouldn't say turned against him, but certainly could no longer be counted on as enthusiastically after 2012, when he became president for a third time. So this game, and this is among even some people that we knew, people who were very concerned about Putin and what he was doing, really disagreed with his policies, just didn't like, and I still believe, it's the country's not really moving in a great direction. But their reaction to Crimea was, look, it doesn't matter, we got it back, and righting historic wrong kind of thing. Now, I'm saying you could agree or disagree. I'm saying how people reacted to it, so that was a huge motivating factor, and it shut a lot of people up in Russia domestically. But again, we didn't hear that on CNN. We didn't hear that on Fox. We didn't hear that anywhere here, and that results in us making these bad decisions. I think.
Yeah, and increasingly, you would expect somebody like Rubio or McCain or Graham to impute to Putin these sort of grand ideological designs, because it's perfectly in keeping with how their foreign policy worldview is constructed. But now you have Democrats taking those cues themselves, where now they're imputing their own version of this grand ideological design to Putin, such that Putin is portrayed as the progenitor of right-wing global extremism now, and he's the dark force behind all these nationalistic movements, everywhere from Brexit to Trump to Le Pen. They've built up a version of Putin in their own minds that seems to be sort of in conflict with the Rubio-McCain version, but they sort of they've forged a mutual goal where they can both exalt Putin as this enemy that needs to be countered, even if they might have a slightly different conception of what program Putin is trying to advance. But both of them reject both factions here reject the more pragmatic take on Putin, because they have their own sort of personal political agendas to burnish, and Putin's a useful foil.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm not saying that he's devoid of ideology. He does have an ideology. I mean, I think that, especially in the late 1990s, I mean, he did adopt, I think, a more kind of what would be called neo-Soviet outlook on foreign policy, really skeptical of the West, more the US than, for example, Germany. Germany is actually much more popular in Russia, but it depends, changes by cycle. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't recognize the US as a power center. That doesn't mean that he doesn't, and this is what you get from a lot of Russian independent analysts. One of them actually cited recently, just a quip because this is sort of relevant, but Putin showed up to give a talk at a factory in outlying province in Russia called Eternal in Latin letters. So, and literally when he was there, one of the workers who was pre-selected asked, so, what are your kind of dreams and ambitions? What do you really want to do right now? He said, I'd like to travel more. I haven't been traveling too much. I've been moving between airports and hotels. I'd really like more time for travel, and I'd love to successfully conclude my career in the future. That would be great. So he goes to a factory called Eternal to talk about successfully concluding his career. I mean, the whole thing is just a PR stunt. And one Russian analyst's response to that was, like, why would Putin be so? I mean, he's always moving around, it seems, and then he's always late for a lot of appointments. He's like, well, he's late for a lot of domestic meetings, like with his domestic advisors, because he doesn't really like to talk and deal with a lot of Russia's internal problems that often. But he's never late for a meeting with Barack Obama. It's sort of like what Barack Obama apparently once said: Putin might be late, but he's never late to meet with me. So from the perspective of this Russian analyst, it's like, you see, the U.S. president, you can't be late to meet with him. So there's a view of the power of the U.S. and the authority of the U.S. president in Russia that's still extremely highly regarded. As opposed to here, which is the narrative of, oh, come on, he's just running through him, he's just running him over, he's Obama is just, irrelevant. And getting back to what that means for, what the Democrats are doing, I think you're right. I mean, it's manufacturing a straw man. It's manufacturing something that also is a great tool for discrediting alternative contrarian ideas about Brexit, about Trump, about anything else. And it allows right to have an excuse to be lazy in their analysis. And it, basically just makes it harder to deal with the actual person. So it's like you're essentially assuming that this guy is either an all-powerful, man behind the curtain who you can't really outmaneuver, or he's someone who just has no respect for you. And there's really no basis to believe that. It's a much more realpolitik kind of relationship that exists and will exist, I think. It's great that it would be nice if we started to approach it in that way. And I think that, what Trump might achieve is exactly that. And that's what some of these people fear, because, if that image of the bogeyman, one way or the other, it's going to be kind of hard to, to have that discussion. anymore, and they've come to rely on it for their own ends. I think you're right.
Yeah. It now seems increasingly clear that the main issue that Democrats are going to elevate as a means of attacking Trump is going to be Russia. I mean, just look at how they've reacted to this Tillerson nomination. I mean, the central fact, the fact that they featured most prominently in their critique of Tillerson has been not the fact that he leads one of the most powerful corporations on earth, which is responsible for all sorts of environmental devastation and is a main factor in emitting carbon into the atmosphere and so on and so forth. They're most concerned about the Russia factor because Tillerson, in his capacity as CEO of ExxonMobil, went to, met with Putin and shook his hand in photos and was given some award. I mean, so that's their main takeaway from the Tillerson nomination. That sort of reinforces their view that Trump is somehow in hoc to the Kremlin, and that was the basis for his wanting to nominate Tillerson. So I actually pulled up the statement here from Senator Robert Menendez of New Jersey, who put out a very vituperative statement on Tillerson. Menendez, by the way, is still under indictment. I don't know why we haven't gotten any updates on that recently, but Menendez states, with Rex Tillerson as our Secretary of State, the Trump administration would be guaranteeing Russia has a willing accomplice in the president's cabinet guiding our nation's foreign policy. So Menendez is basically suggesting that Putin, in his omniscience, is somehow going to be remotely, guiding, quote unquote, American foreign policy by way of Tillerson.
Yeah, I mean, this is Yuri Red Alert kind of stuff, right? I mean, this is like Yuri Red Alert series, right?
Yeah,
Games,
no, I played that as a kid. This is like
yeah, I mean, this
is like John Birch Society, 1960.
But yeah, I mean, it's right. So, I mean, so the question is, do we take this at face value? I mean, with all due respect to those who have legitimate criticisms. I mean, I'm not saying that these people don't legitimately have criticisms. It's hard to separate, to not be too cynical about this. But, what I'm saying is why are they playing this card? I think that gets to your underlying question. Like, as you said, why are they focused on this rather than, the Democrats, the environmental record, the Republicans, something else? I mean, why are they focusing on this particular card? Those who are skeptical about this. I mean, is it because why are they playing it? Because they were legitimately concerned seriously that this is what will happen, or is this to bludgeon Trump?
It's to bludgeon Trump. It's totally to bludgeon Trump. That's it.
Right, to bludgeon Trump for the Democrats. But why are potentially Jeff Flake, John McCain, Marco Rubio, a friend of I would be somebody who got an award from Vladimir Putin, I would be concerned about. In other words, the Archbishop of Canterbury got the same award. I mean, these awards are like, give it. I mean, this is like the king of, the Emir of Qatar giving you an award. I mean, I really wouldn't want to know how many facilities in Florida, educational institutions, the Qataris may have funded, or anybody, or the Emirates may have funded over the years. I mean, I'm sure Marco Rubio is not going to be protesting in front of those institutions for accepting those donations, right? Or accepting. I mean, this is just. I mean, it's really just sort of saying, even though he was the CEO of the largest oil company in the world, he needed to be a politician, which would have been against the interests of his shareholders, other problems. And with this particular country, in other words, it was totally fine for him to have similarly close relationships with the Gulf states, the Emirates, and the Qataris, and countless other countries. But for some reason, in this particular case, I mean, Russia just happens to have, the second largest proven natural gas reserves in the world, largest huge oil deposits. Pretty much impossible to get tenders to do any business there unless you're in partnership with a Russian state-owned company and you independently as a going concern. And it's very, very hard. I mean, it's just the nature of the way the system works in terms of the marriage between the state and the energy sector there. I mean, what did you expect, with all due, honestly, Tillerson to have been doing? So why? So the statement itself, that reaction doesn't make sense given an award from Vladimir Putin, as if he sent him a box of chocolates or something. Like, this is a sincere, good friends stretching back all these years or something. So the statement itself is kind of problematic, and then not even having the context of what Tillerson was engaged in at the time. I mean, why is this happening? Like, what is the motivation here? Why is he getting? No, what do you think? Now I'm asking you. Like, what do you think that fear is? I mean, John McCain and Lindsey Graham, I think we could be a bit more in terms of their very deeply held worldviews. But some of these other people, like, I'm really trying to assess this. Like, what do they think they're going to gain?
I mean, with regard to Menendez in particular, he's sort of a unique case. So he's a Democrat, but he basically is indistinguishable from a McCain or a Graham or a Rubio on foreign policy. I mean, he's an ideologue. So I think that basically explains why Menendez would come out with such a inflammatory statement. I mean, look at what Menendez has said over the years about Iran, about Israel, about Cuba. I mean, he's been a thorn in the Obama administration's side on all these issues for a long time now, including Russia. So, I think that just has to do with the peculiarities of Menendez. But even so, I mean, there are other examples of Democrats coming out and making statements about their concerns or their worries with respect to Tillerson that maybe aren't quite as incendiary.
Like Schumer.
Yeah, Schumer, right? Or even Cory Booker put out a statement that was like touched on similar themes. So Cory Booker probably wouldn't be as hawkish overall as Menendez. Actually, definitely not. But still, they're still sort of feigning disbelief that this could happen and that there could be like a usurpation of the State Department on behalf of Russian interests. So I mean, I think it's cynical because the American people don't know a lot about the bilateral U.S.-Russia relationship. So if they see
that's bad.
Yeah. That's bad. So this, which is to say that it's easily exploitable for people who want to score cheap points. And I think, by the way, that's why you see Mitch McConnell not making a big deal out of it, because he's a conservative Republican, but he's not a virulent ideologue in the way that, say, McCain is or Graham. So he's not. So if somebody who he was a little less friendly disposed to ideologically had been in a similar position as Trump, so maybe seen as having suspiciously close associations with Russian government actors, you could see theoretically McConnell adopting a more inflammatory posture. But since he's not an ideologue, he's sort of like a pragmatist and just a deal maker and a genuine creature of just the Washington establishment. He's not in a frenzy about it. But I think Democrats are in a frenzy about it because they have the additional partisan motivation on top of it, and they don't know how else to approach Trump. I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to a reluctance to introspect on the part of Democrats and to take stock of what led them to fail so spectacularly, what led them to rally around a horribly flawed candidate in Hillary Clinton. So if they can attribute her loss to external factors, Russia just being one of them, and then you have the James Comey denialism, the FBI kind of led some kind of internal coup, according to some of these people. I mean, that's going to absolve them of responsibility for really having to interrogate why it is that they lost to the guy from The Apprentice.
Right.
So I mean, I think that's sort of one of the really driving main factor here. And they're just sort of cynically, latching on to whatever Russia hysteria bubbles up at any given time to reinforce that.
Right, and here's sort of, and this kind of arc back to what we started with, is that the analysis in the Russian media about Trump, about the election is, what does this mean for soberly, seriously, just like having an academic discussion, agree, disagree on perspectives for U.S.-Russia relations going forward. Syria, Ukraine, Crimea, Eastern Europe, China and problems that fissures that Russia and China have there, and Japan and the disputes that Russia and Japan have over, World War II, post-World War II islands. There are serious discussions being had among credible analysts, academics, policy analysts, people, veterans of government or whatever. Whereas here, we're talking about this stuff. So, in other words, this card will be tapped out eventually. I think Tillerson will be confirmed. That's my view. I mean, eventually this card will be tapped out. I think it's going to be a huge swing and a miss coming on the back of this crazy recount and all this other stuff. Now the elector, I liked your tweet. The electors are sort of, political people and hacks. Like, why are they getting intel briefings? Right?
They're not going to be getting an intel briefing. Believe me, they're not going to be getting an intel briefing. They're not going to get security clearance over the next 5 days to get an intel briefing.
Yeah, Betty Smith from Indiana. I think I really need to have that intel briefing. Can you give me the daily intel report?
It's sort of a tangential point, but the politicization of the Electoral College is now just amazing. So all these people who are now are advocating for intelligence briefings and for lobbying campaign to try to convince electors to subvert the will of their state's voters, they were all the same people who were complaining about Trump violating norms.
Right.
But this would be the most egregious norm violation maybe in U.S. history. That's what they now want. To totally revamp and upend the way that the Electoral College functioned historically. And they're going to be, a lot of them are citing the Russian supposed interference as a reason why this would be justified. Because if you go look at one of the Federalist Papers, supposedly one of the main aims of the Electoral College was to be the final bulwark against potential foreign interference. So they're saying now this Russian stuff would be justification to just throw into centuries of precedent into the trash. The Electoral College should just unilaterally decide to make it subjective to determination and prevent Trump from taking power.
Right, but we've agreed that that's not really what the reason they're doing this. They're just doing this to, see if they can finally swing for the fences and actually get a hit. Like they're sick of foul balls. They want to see if they can actually land a punch. Like, I mean, it's sort of, I don't even know like what would be the proper kind of metaphor for this. It's just, it's like, it really is kind of like you can't get over a bad breakup, so you show up at your ex's house and just start slashing tires or something. I mean, this is really what it's essentially generating into. Like, we're having an intellectual conversation about serious, and now you brought in the Federalist Papers and stuff. Like, that's not the point. Like, this is all just, we agree, this is all just static. Like, so this is Nancy Pelosi, who was laughing when somebody asked, are constitutional arguments a basis for rejecting any federal legislative proposals? And she literally could barely conceal a laugh. And now she and the Clinton campaign are defenders of the Constitution and the sanctity of the American Republic. I mean, come on. So what I'm saying is, at the end of the day, for me, what's interesting is we'll play out the Russian card. I don't think it's going to work. I think people are already moving past this. They still seem to continue digging the hole. And I mean, this. I think this, you're right, the peak of hysteria will continue for the next couple of weeks, good for analysts. But after that, what's going to happen with U.S.-Russia relations? Back to what the Russian analysts are focused on, which is what matters. That's what they're focused on. Like,
I think people are still so unnerved, and they're still so disoriented by Trump's victory that the notion of transitioning to some sort of longer-term policy discussion just seems alien. I mean, they're still trying to regain their composure. I mean, so that's why they jump for these rash, kind of temporary little hysterias that seem to be popping up. And this week it's Russia. So I mean, that's the frame of mind they're in. It's still so incomprehensible to them that Trump won that they're in no position to be thinking soberly about policy, and I don't know when they will be, because they're still in the denial phase of the grief cycle. I mean, and the latest Russia mania. I mean, that just kind of assured that they're going to remain in the denial phase for the foreseeable future, or at least for the next couple of weeks at minimum, maybe even longer. So once they reach acceptance, then maybe they'll come down from their high, and begin to grapple with what policy aims they should be trying to advance. But for now, it's still so raw that they can't engage in that discussion yet.
Right, but I'm stunned at how they've just continued on this path, like that they've just marshaled all of these resources that have failed time and again. They could be already starting to, you're right, not only take stock of what happened, but divert those resources, media resources, political resources, toward engaging the incoming Trump administration or working amongst themselves to try to figure out, okay, if we have concerns about some aspects of what Trump might do vis-a-vis Russia, which I don't think would be, we're not going back to 40 years ago. I mean, again, I think that this is going to be a largely non-ideological approach, very pragmatic approach to Russia at the end of the day. Some people don't want that. I recognize that, but shouldn't you be sort of voicing your concerns that way? Be honest about what it is that you're concerned about, if you are in fact concerned, or that's what where the energy should be channeled. Instead, by using this is a very dangerous 24-hour news cycle fig leaf to be to be waving, I think, because like I said, it might lead to stupid mistakes being made. I'm not saying like statements or anything like that necessarily from any of these media people, but like it just blows us off course, and maybe based upon this hysteria, somebody will start to do something, or that might start a chain reaction that might lead us heaven knows where. So
And they're just,
it's kind of like so I guess to me it's like there are many fig leaves that you could be using. I mean, this is sort of reaching into getting the chainsaw. Like, we're past the point of, throwing stones at glass houses. Now it's the point of like, okay, at the Trump window, being thrown at the window of, at Trump's castle hasn't really made much impact. So now I'm gonna get a wrecking ball and try to smash through the, through the outer walls.
Because they don't accept the election as legitimate. I mean, they fundamentally do not accept the outcome as legitimate, and the Russian so-called interference would be one reason for that. They also look at the popular vote issue as somehow minimizing Trump's victory. So Hillary is the popular vote winner, therefore she's the real winner. That's what a lot of people genuinely believe. And then you have, and then the Comey FBI issue. So there are a range of factors which have led people to just flatly reject the outcome of the election as legitimate. Therefore, they don't feel it's incumbent on them to transition to any kind of sober, policy-oriented analysis. They want to just make the case that Trump ought not to have won. So, in a sense, going into that policy discussion would be seen as a legitimization of Trump. So they're not going to resist that until the very last moment.
No, I think you're right. But the problem is when they do accept it, it's going to be like, the train isn't going to be pulling back into the station it just left to pick up the passengers that were late to get on. I mean, they're just not going to be part of that discussion. They're not going to have that access, and they're not going to be able to, if they have any genuine concerns. I don't know if they do. I think they just don't. A lot of these people are just reacting and just spewing, saying things to see what sticks. I don't think that would, they're going to cut themselves out of that discussion, and that would be problematic. So we're going to have, less of a marketplace of ideas in terms of views on real policy issues. And again, this will settle one way or another. This man is going to be president. He's going to have this cabinet, and there might be a change in Russia policy. What's interesting to me is what that will entail. I think that it won't be as fundamental as a lot of people think. That's what I'm focused on. I mean, I'm glad this one good thing is, kind of the hysteria at least has us talking about Russia again. It's not the way that I would want to be talking about it, but at the end of the day, there might be enough of the, enough value extracted from all this static, that, and what we're doing now, now we've probably now in the last hour and a half talked more about the background of U.S.-Russia relations, Russia's policy motivations, and all of that, than we've heard in the U.S. media for the past 6 months. I mean, if you were to take a sum total of value add from the Washington Post, New York Times, and certainly all of the main broadcast media, I mean, like, they haven't, none of this has made very little of this has made an appearance. So, this has got people talking, and this has brought the issue to the fore. And I think that once this dust settles and we start, either they accept it or they don't, and they move on to some other issue, I hope we're going to be left with more positive takeaways, and we can use that as a basis to now have a much more nuanced discussion about this, premised on how ridiculous the hysteria was than we would otherwise if we didn't have. So that's.
Well, with that, we should pat ourselves on the back, congratulate each other for bringing this vital information to our viewers. And I guess leave it there for now. There'll be plenty more to discuss in the future. But in the meantime, this was, I hope, a useful conversation for people to be a part of. So thank you, Boris.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
All right, take care.